The morning they buried Thomas Chandler, the wind came down off the Kansas plains hard enough to rattle the pine boards of his coffin, and Ella Chandler stood at the grave's edge with dirt already staining the hem of her one good black dress, thinking that grief was a debt collector who never once knocked before letting himself in. It was the spring of 1878, and the town of Prairie Rose, Kansas, sat like a scattering of gray buildings against an endless sea of new grass, the kind of place where the wind talked more than the people did. Ella was 22 years old, unmarried, and now, according to the banker who stood a respectful distance from the mourners with his hat in his hands and calculation in his eyes, in possession of 640 acres of the best bottomland along Willow Creek that anyone in 3 counties had ever seen. Silas Crow had not come to the funeral out of grief. Ella knew that the moment she saw him lingering near the wagon, his black coat too fine for a dirt farmer's burial, his boots too clean. He had loaned her father money 2 winters back when the drought had taken the wheat and half the cattle besides, and now that her father was gone, cold in the ground before his 50th year, Crow had come to collect. "Miss Chandler," he said, once the last of the mourners had drifted off toward their wagons and buggies, leaving only Ella the preacher and the raw mounded earth. "I am sorry for your loss. Truly I am. Your father was a fine man and a poor businessman, God rest him." "Say what you came to say, Mr. Crow." He turned his hat in his hands, a gesture she would come to recognize as his way of appearing humble while delivering the worst news a person could hear. "The note on this land comes due in 90 days, $400 plus what interest has accrued. I don't imagine you have that sum sitting in a coffee tin, Miss Chandler." She did not. She had $11.40, a milk cow, 4 hens, and a father freshly dead. "I'll find a way. There's an easier way." Crow stepped closer, and she caught the smell of bay rum and tobacco on him, a scent she would forever after associate with men who wanted something they had not earned. "Marry me, Ella. I'll tear up that note myself. You keep your house, keep your creek, keep your father's grave close by instead of watching some stranger plow over it. I've got a fine house in town, and you'd never want for anything again." "I would want for a husband I did not despise," she said, and walked to her wagon without looking back, though her hands shook on the reins the whole ride home, because she was not certain, not truly, that pride alone would be enough to keep Willow Creek out of Silas Crow's hands. Her father's will, when the circuit lawyer read it to her 3 days later in the front room of the house she had grown up in, held one more complication she had not expected. Thomas Chandler, in his careful, practical way, had written a clause meant to protect his daughter from exactly the kind of man Silas Crow was. "Your father specified," the lawyer said, adjusting his spectacles, "that the land passes to you outright and free of any male guardian's claim, provided you are married within 6 months of his death, to a man of your own choosing. He worried, I believe, that an unmarried woman alone on good bottomland would draw men like flies to honey, and not the kind of men worth marrying. If you remain unwed past that date, the land reverts to his brother in Ohio, who has never once set foot in Kansas and would sell to the first buyer at the first opportunity. He wanted to protect me," Ella said quietly, "and instead he's handed me over to whoever asks first." "He trusted you to choose wisely," the lawyer said. "That is not quite the same thing. She had 6 months to marry, and Silas Crow's note came due in 3. The arithmetic of it kept her awake at night, staring at the ceiling of the room she had slept in since she was a girl, listening to the wind worry at the shutters like something trying to get in. It was the preacher's wife, Mrs. Iris Abernathy, who first mentioned Ezekiel Trask's name to her, over a cup of chicory coffee gone half cold in the church kitchen. "There's a man come through with the Baylor cattle drive," Mrs. Abernathy said. "Stayed on in town when the herd moved on. Says he's tired of the trail. Ezekiel Trask, his name is. Rode for the Confederacy as a boy, so they say, though he doesn't talk of it. Works honest, drinks little, and hasn't once tried to cheat anyone at cards, which in this town is practically a character reference from the Almighty. You're suggesting I marry a stranger off a cattle drive. I'm suggesting, Mrs. Abernathy said, not unkindly, that you have 3 months and a mortgage, and Pride has never once paid a debt that I've heard of. Ella found Ezekiel Trask 2 days later, mending a stretch of split-rail fence outside the livery stable for wages. His shirt sleeves rolled to the elbow and sweat darkening the back of his collar, despite the cool spring air. He was tall, built lean the way men got who had spent years in the saddle instead of behind a plow, with dark hair that wanted cutting, and a face that had seen more sun and trouble than a man his age ought to have. Though she could not have said exactly how old he was, perhaps 26 or 27. "Mr. Trask," she said, and he turned, setting down the mallet he'd been using to drive a fence post, and looked at her with a kind of careful attention that she was not used to receiving from men in Prairie Rose, most of whom looked at her the way they might look at a good milk cow, appraisingly, and with an eye toward what she could produce. "Miss Chandler." He knew her name, of course. Everyone in town knew the story of the Chandler girl and her dead father and the note coming due. "What can I do for you?" She had rehearsed the words on the ride into town, and still they came out clumsier than she wanted. "I have a proposal for you, Mr. Trask, and I would ask you to hear the whole of it before you laugh me off this street." He did not laugh. He listened, his gray eyes steady on her face, while she laid it out plain. The land, the note, the will, the 6 months narrowing fast toward 3. She told him she needed a husband in name and in labor, a man to work the land and stand as her legal protector so that Silas Crow could not take Willow Creek out from under her, and that in exchange he would have a half share in whatever the ranch produced, a roof, and her word that she would never ask more of the arrangement than he was willing to give. "You're offering me marriage," he said slowly, "the way another man might offer a job driving cattle. I'm offering you a fair trade, Mr. Trask. I don't have romance to offer. I have 640 acres of the best grass in the county, a creek that's never once run dry even in the worst drought years, and a debt I cannot pay alone. I won't pretend it's anything prettier than what it is." Something moved behind his eyes then, something she couldn't read, gone as quickly as it came. "And if I say no? Then I suppose I marry Silas Crow, or I lose my father's land to a man in Ohio who's never seen it, and either way I expect I'll spend the rest of my life wondering what might have been different if I'd found the courage to ask a stranger for help instead." He was quiet a long moment, turning the mallet over in his hands. "I'll want to see the land before I answer. That seems fair. And I'll want your word, Miss Chandler, that this is an honest arrangement and not some trick to get a man's back broken on a piece of ground he'll never truly own. You'd own half of everything that ground produces, Mr. Trask. That's not a trick. That's a partnership." He looked at her a long moment more, and then he nodded, once, the way a man nods when he has made a decision he suspects he will spend considerable time second-guessing. "All right, Miss Chandler. Show me your land." They rode out to Willow Creek the following afternoon, Ella on her father's old bay mare and Ezekiel on a borrowed horse from the livery, and she watched him take in the 640 acres with an expression she could only call hunger, though not the greedy kind she'd seen in Silas Crow's face. It was the look of a man who had spent years sleeping under other men's stars, tending other men's cattle, and was seeing, perhaps for the first time, a piece of ground he might actually call his own. "This creek run all year?" he asked, crouching at the water's edge, letting it run cool over his fingers. Even in the drought of '76, when half the county's wells went dry, this creek never dropped more than a foot. My father always said it was fed from somewhere deeper than the rest, some underground spring nobody's ever found the source of. "That's worth more than gold out here," Ezekiel said, "and you know it, which is why Crow wants it so bad he can taste it." "I know it." He stood, wiping his hand on his trousers, and looked at her with those steady gray eyes. "I had a piece of land once, Miss Chandler, back in Missouri, before the war took it and gave it to somebody else's cannon fire. I've been riding other men's ranges for 12 years trying to forget what it felt like to have dirt under my boots that belonged to me and nobody else. I won't pretend your offer isn't tempting for reasons that have nothing to do with you personally. I'd rather have honesty than pretty words, Mr. Trask. Then I'll marry you, he said, and I'll work this land like it's my own, because for all intents and purposes it will be. But I want you to understand something plain before we stand in front of a preacher and make promises we intend to keep. I'm not marrying you for charity, and you're not marrying me for love. We're both getting something we need. There's no shame in that, so long as neither of us pretends it's something it isn't. Agreed, she said, and they shook hands on it like men closing a cattle deal, though something in the warmth of his palm against hers lingered longer in her memory than she expected it to. They were married 11 days later in the Prairie Rose Methodist Church, with Mrs. Abernathy weeping happily in the front pew as though she had personally arranged the whole affair, which in a sense she had. Ella wore her mother's wedding dress, taken in at the waist, and Ezekiel wore a borrowed coat that fit him poorly across the shoulders, and when the preacher asked if he would take Ella Chandler as his lawful wife, he said, "I will," in a voice steady enough that no one in the church could have guessed the arrangement's true bones, except perhaps Silas Crow, who stood at the back near the door with his hat in his hands and a look on his face like a man who had just watched a hand of cards he was certain he'd one turn against him at the final draw. "You'll regret this," Crow said to her afterward on the church steps, low enough that only she could hear. "That man's got nothing, Ella. No land, no name worth speaking of, no future beyond whatever you hand him. You've married a drifter to spite me, and one day you'll wake up and realize spite doesn't pay a mortgage. The mortgage will be paid, Mr. Crow, in full, before the note comes due. And you'll never again ask me to marry you, because I already have a husband, and unlike you, he asked for nothing but honest work in exchange for helping me." She walked away from him with her new husband's arm under her hand, and if that arm was stiff and unfamiliar, and if the whole business felt more like a business transaction dressed up in lace than a wedding, she told herself it did not matter, because she had kept her father's land, and that had been the whole point from the start. The first weeks of the marriage were an education in the particular loneliness of sharing a house with a stranger. Ezekiel moved his few belongings into the small room off the kitchen that had once been her father's study, and Ella kept to her own room upstairs, and they met at meals and in the fields and spoke to each other the careful, polite language of business partners rather than husband and wife. He worked. She would give him that. He worked from before dawn until the light failed each evening, mending fences her father had let go slack in his last sick months, repairing the barn roof, breaking a pair of young horses she had bought cheap at auction, because no one else wanted the trouble of gentling them. He had a way with animals that surprised her, a low, patient voice he used with the horses that she sometimes caught herself listening for through the walls, wondering what it might feel like to have that same patience turned toward her. "You don't have to prove yourself to me," she told him one evening in June, when he came in from the barn so tired he could barely lift his fork, his hands raw from 3 days of fence work in the sun. "I already agreed to the marriage. You don't need to work yourself into the ground to earn what's already yours by contract. It's not about earning it, Miss Chandler." He still called her that weeks into the marriage, and she had stopped correcting him because she was not entirely sure what she wanted him to call her instead. "It's about not being the kind of man who takes something and lets it go to ruin out of laziness. Your father built something worth keeping. I mean to keep it. You could call me Ella, you know. We are married." Something like embarrassment crossed his face, quick and unguarded, the first genuinely unguarded thing she had seen from him since their wedding day. "Ella, then. If you'll call me Ezekiel instead of Mr. Trask like I'm some hired hand you're not sure you trust yet." "Ezekiel," she said, testing the name, and found she liked the shape of it in her mouth more than she expected to. Summer deepened, and with it came the particular hard beauty of the Kansas plains in full green, the grass tall enough to hide a man on horseback, the sky so wide and blue it seemed to press down on the land like a held breath. Ella found herself, in those long golden evenings, watching her husband from the porch as he worked the horses in the corral, and feeling something in her chest that she did not have a name for yet, something that was not quite the cold practicality she had promised herself the marriage would be built on. It was Ezekiel who first noticed the cattle going missing. "I counted 42 head Tuesday," he said one morning in July, coming into the kitchen with his hat still on, which she had learned meant trouble, because he was careful about manners even when he was tired. "This morning I counted 36. Wolves. No wolf takes 6 head of cattle in 3 days without leaving a single carcass or a drop of blood anywhere on this land. Somebody drove them off, Ella, and drove them off clean, which takes more than one man and more skill than any drifter passing through would bother to use on a small operation like ours. Crow. I can't prove it. But I know cattle thieves, and this has the smell of a man who wants to bleed you slow rather than take everything at once and risk the law getting interested." She felt the old fear return, the one she had thought marriage had put to rest. "If he takes enough cattle, we won't be able to make the mortgage payment come September. We won't lose this land, Ella. I gave you my word." He said it simply, without bravado, the way he said most things, and she found she believed him more completely than she had believed anyone in a long time, which frightened her a little, because belief was a kind of vulnerability she had not planned for when she proposed a business arrangement to a stranger mending fences outside a livery stable. They rode the fence lines together after that, taking turns keeping watch through the short summer nights, and it was on one of those nights, lying wrapped in a blanket near the northern boundary with the stars wheeling slow overhead and Ezekiel a dark shape beside her, rifle across his knees, that she first asked him about the war. "You don't have to answer," she said, when he went quiet at the question. "I know some men don't like to speak of it. I was 15 when I rode with my older brother's cavalry unit," he said finally, his voice low, pitched for her ears alone in the vast dark. "Too young to know what I was riding into. My brother died at Pea Ridge. I kept riding because I didn't know what else to do with myself, and by the time the war ended I was 19 and had forgotten how to be anything but a soldier. Took me years of cattle drives to remember. There was a world outside of taking orders and burying men younger than I am now." "I'm sorry," she said and meant it, and reached out in the dark to find his hand, and he let her hold it, though neither of them said anything more about it, and in the morning they did not speak of the moment at all, though she noticed he sat a little closer to her at breakfast than he had before. August brought the drought that everyone in the county had been dreading since the dry spring, and with it came Selah's Crow's next move, delivered by a boy on a mule with a letter bearing the bank's official seal. "He's calling the note early," Ella said, reading it twice to be certain she had not misunderstood. "He says market conditions require immediate repayment of the full balance, plus interest, within 30 days, or he takes possession of the land. He can't do that. The original note said 90 days from your father's death, and that's not for another 6 weeks. There's a clause here about market instability granting the lender discretion to call the note early. My father must not have read it carefully or trusted Crow more than he should have." Ezekiel took the letter from her and read it himself, his jaw tightening as he did. "This is theft with a lawyer's signature on it. It's legal theft, which is worse, because there's no sheriff in this county who will stand against a banker's paperwork." She sank into a chair at the kitchen table, the weight of it settling over her like a physical thing. "We don't have $400, Ezekiel. We have maybe 60, after what the stolen cattle cost us. Then we'll find a way to get $400 in 30 days, or we'll find a way to make Crow regret ever trying." She looked up at him, surprised by the hard certainty in his voice. "What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking there's a cattle buyer in Dodge City paying top dollar for beef right now, on account of the railroad needing to feed workers laying track west. If we drive what cattle we have left there ourselves, cut out the middleman, we might get enough to cover the note. It's 60 miles of hard country and it's just the two of us to manage a herd that size, but I've driven cattle longer distances with worse odds. 60 miles, just the two of us. I know it's a risk. I know it's asking a great deal. But I don't see another road that gets us to $400 in 30 days without selling off land we can't afford to sell. She thought of her father, of the will he'd written trying to protect her, of Sela's crow's smug face on the church steps promising she'd regret her choice. Then we drive them to Dodge City. They left 3 days later, with 38 head of cattle, 2 horses, and provisions enough for a week if they were careful, riding out at first light while the grass was still silvered with dew. It was work Ella had never done before, and her body ached in places she had not known could ache after the first day alone. But Ezekiel taught her as they went, showing her how to read the cattle's moods, how to keep them moving without spooking them, how to find water and graze enough to keep the herd from losing condition on the trail. "You're a natural," he told her on the second evening, as they sat by a small fire eating beans and hardtack, the cattle settled and grazing nearby under a sky gone purple and gold with sunset. "Most greenhorns I've driven cattle with would have quit by now or gotten themselves trampled. I had a good teacher." She meant it as simple courtesy, but something in the way he looked at her when she said it made the words feel like more than that, made the space between them at the fire feel smaller than it had been a moment before. "Ella," he said her name carefully, the way a man says something he has been turning over in his mind for a while before deciding to speak it aloud. "I want to ask you something, and I want you to know you don't owe me an answer if it's not one you're ready to give." "All right. When we married, we agreed it was a business arrangement, nothing more. I've kept to that agreement or tried to. But I find myself, more days than not lately, forgetting that's all it's supposed to be. I find myself watching you work the herd today and thinking things a business partner has no business thinking about the woman across the fire from him." Her breath caught somewhere in her chest, and she was grateful for the darkness that hid whatever her face was doing. "What kind of things, Ezekiel?" "The kind of things," he said slowly, "that make a man start hoping the marriage might become something more than the paper it was built on." She did not answer right away. The fire popped and settled, and somewhere in the dark a coyote called, distant and lonesome, and she thought about the 11 days between his agreeing to marry her and the wedding itself, how she had spent that time telling herself firmly that this was business, only business, and how thoroughly that certainty had eroded in the months since. "I think," she said finally, "that I have been hoping the same thing and too frightened to say it plainly, because I was the one who insisted this be nothing more than an arrangement, and it seemed unfair to change the terms on you after the fact." "I don't mind the terms changing," he said, "so long as we're both changing them together." He reached across the small space between them and took her hand, and this time neither of them pretended it was only for warmth or comfort against the dark, and when he leaned in and kissed her, gently, questioningly, as though giving her every chance to pull away if she wanted to, she did not pull away at all but leaned into it, into him, and felt something settle in her chest that had been unsettled since the day her father died. They reached Dodge City on the 6th day, trail-worn and sunburned, with 36 head of cattle, having lost 2 to a bad stretch of alkali water on the 4th day that Ezekiel had not caught in time, a loss that grieved him more than Ella expected, until she understood it was not the money he mourned but the failure, the sense that he had not protected what was under his care as well as he wanted to. The cattle buyer, a broad, sun-weathered man named Higgins who ran a yard just outside the rail depot, looked over the herd with a practiced eye and offered them $11 a head, better than they had dared hope, enough that when the final tally came due, Ezekiel counted out the bills into Ella's palm with something like wonder on his face. $496, he said. "Enough for the note and something left besides. We did it." She laughed, half in disbelief, and threw her arms around his neck right there in the dusty cattle yard, not caring who saw, and he caught her up and spun her once before setting her down, both of them laughing now, giddy with relief and exhaustion and something warmer underneath both. They spent one night in Dodge City in a real bed at a boarding house, the first real bed either of them had slept in for a week, and Ella would remember that night for the rest of her life, as the night the marriage of convenience became, quietly and without either of them announcing it to the other, a marriage of love. There was nothing businesslike in the way Ezekiel held her that night, nothing of contracts or arrangements in the way she whispered his name in the dark, and when they rode back toward Prairie Rose the next morning, they rode close together, hands sometimes brushing, and spoke of small things, of the ranch, of what they might build there together, in a way that felt entirely different from the careful politeness of the marriage's first months. They paid the note in full 3 days before Sela's Crow's deadline, and Ella never forgot the look on his face when Ezekiel counted the bills onto his desk in the bank, $400 and the accrued interest besides, every cent accounted for. "You'll want a receipt," Ezekiel said, "and I want you to know, Mr. Crow, that if so much as one more head of cattle goes missing off Willow Creek land, I'll be paying you a visit that has nothing to do with banking business." "I don't know what you're implying, Mr. Trask." "I'm not implying anything. I'm telling you plain. Whatever game you're playing, it's over. The land's paid for free and clear, and it's not for sale, not now, not ever, no matter what price you offer or what tricks you try." Crow wrote the receipt with a hand that trembled slightly with barely contained anger, and Ella took it from him without a word, and they walked out of the bank into the bright autumn sun with the land finally, truly, entirely their own. It should have been the end of the trouble, and for a time it seemed to be. The autumn passed in the ordinary business of ranch life, gathering the herd for winter, laying in stores, mending the house against the coming cold, and in the evenings Ella and Ezekiel sat together by the fire, and she found herself, more and more, forgetting that there had ever been a version of their marriage that was not exactly this, warm and easy and full of a tenderness that had grown up between them like grass after rain. But love, once it takes root, has a way of making a person vulnerable in ways that pure business never could, and it was in November, when the first hard frost had silvered the grass, that the town's gossip finally caught up with them in a way that cut deeper than either of them expected. They had gone into Prairie Rose together for supplies, and Ella had gone into the general store while Ezekiel saw to the horses, and it was there, among the flour sacks and coffee tins, that she overheard 2 women she had known her whole life, Mrs. Pemberton and Mrs. Otis, speaking in the low, carrying whispers women use when they want to be certain they are heard. "Well, of course he married her for the land," Mrs. Pemberton was saying. "A drifter like that, no family, no property to his name, marries a woman with 600 acres inside of 2 weeks of meeting her. What else would a man like that want with a plain girl like Ella Chandler, if not the land under her feet?" "I heard he's already talking of expanding the herd," Mrs. Otis said, "building up what's hers into something grander. Man's got ambition, that's plain to see, and ambition finds the fastest road to what it wants." Ella set down the coffee tin she had been holding and walked out of the store without buying anything, her face burning, and did not speak on the ride home, though Ezekiel asked twice if something was wrong, and she said only that she had a headache, which was not entirely a lie, because the words had lodged themselves behind her eyes like a splinter she could not work free. It festered through the following days, that overheard cruelty, no matter how she tried to reason herself out of caring what small-minded women in a general store thought of her marriage. It festered because some small, frightened part of her had wondered the same thing in the earliest days, before she had known him, before the cattle drive and the fire, and the slow accumulation of tenderness that had built between them, and old fears, once given air, are hard to smother back down. It came to a head on a cold evening in late November, when Ezekiel came in from checking the herd with news that made the fear worse instead of better. "I've been thinking," he said, stamping snow from his boots by the door, "that come spring, We ought to think about expanding. There's open range to the west of the creek that nobody's claimed. If we filed on it under the Homestead Act, in your name since you're the one with the existing claim, we could double our grazing land within a year or two." He meant it. She could see, as good news, as a plan for their shared future. But something in her, some old wound freshly reopened by Mrs. Pemberton's whispers, heard it differently, heard only a man talking of expanding what he stood to gain from a marriage he had entered with an eye toward exactly this kind of profit. "Is that what this has all been?" The words came out sharper than she intended, sharper than she felt if she was honest with herself, but the fear had its own momentum by then, and she could not seem to stop it. "Building up an empire, 1 acre at a time, off the back of a marriage you talked your way into." He stared at her, genuinely startled. "Ella, where is this coming from?" "I heard the women in town talking at the general store about how you married me for the land, how a drifter with nothing to his name saw an easy road to property and took it, and I told myself they were wrong. I told myself I knew you better than that. And then you come home talking about expanding, about doubling what we've got. And I don't know any more, Ezekiel. I don't know if any of what's passed between us these last months has been real, or if I've just been a convenient road to something you wanted long before you ever met me." The words hung in the air between them, ugly and unfair even as she said them, and she saw them land on his face like a physical blow, saw something close off behind his eyes that had been open to her for months now. "You married me for my land," she said again, quieter now, the accusation turning into something more like a question, more like a plea for him to prove her wrong, though she dressed it in the clothes of certainty because she did not know how else to ask it. "That's what this whole marriage was built on, isn't it? Whatever's grown up between us since, it started there, with land, with a business deal, and I don't know how to trust that it's become anything more than that." Ezekiel was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice was steady but with an edge of hurt she had never heard in it before. "I married you despite it," he said. "Ella, look at me. I married you despite the land, not for it. I had my choice back in June, standing at that fence with a mallet in my hand. I could have kept drifting, kept riding other men's ranges the way I'd done for 12 years. No ties, no risk, nothing to lose. Instead, I chose to marry a woman I'd known one afternoon and take on her debts and her enemies and her father's dying wishes because something in you, standing there proposing marriage to a stranger like you were negotiating a cattle sale, made me want to know the woman brave enough to do that. The land was never the point, Ella. The land was the excuse I gave myself for staying, because I wasn't ready yet to admit the truth of why I really wanted to." "And what's the truth?" Her voice had gone soft now, uncertain, the anger draining out of her as quickly as it had risen, leaving something rawer behind it. "The truth is I fell in love with you somewhere on that trail to Dodge City, watching you work a herd you'd never handled before like you'd been born to it, watching you refuse to quit even when your hands were blistered and your back ached worse than mine. I fell in love with you around a campfire when you took my hand in the dark and didn't ask for anything in return. I've got 640 acres of the finest land in this county, sure, and I won't pretend that's nothing. But I'd give every acre of it back to Selah's Crow tomorrow if it meant keeping you. And I need you to understand that difference, Ella, because if you don't, then everything since June has been built on sand, and I don't think either of us can survive that being true." She was crying by the time he finished, though she had not noticed the tears start, and she crossed the small distance between them and put her arms around him, burying her face against his chest, feeling his heart beating hard and fast beneath his shirt. "I'm sorry," she said. "I let 2 spiteful women's gossip nearly undo something I know in my bones is true. I know you didn't marry me for the land, Ezekiel. I've known it for weeks now, maybe longer, and I let old fear speak louder than what I know. You don't owe me an apology for being afraid," he said into her hair, his arms tight around her. "Lord knows I've got my own fears about this, about you waking up one day and realizing you settled for a drifter with nothing when you could have had a man of real means. We're both carrying old wounds into this marriage, Ella. Seems to me the trick isn't pretending we don't have them. It's choosing, every day, to trust each other with them anyway. They stood like that a long while, by the fire, saying nothing more, needing nothing more said. And when they finally moved to their bed that night, it was with the particular tenderness of two people who had nearly lost something precious, and had been given, through honesty, a second chance to hold on to it. Winter that year was hard, harder than most, with snow drifting deep enough to bury fence posts and cold enough to freeze the creek's edges, though the deep spring at its heart kept a channel running clear all through the worst of it, just as Thomas Chandler had always claimed it would. Ella and Ezekiel spent the long, cold months close together, out of necessity as much as affection, tending the herd through the worst of the storms, mending harness and tack by lamplight, and talking, always talking now, about everything and nothing, filling in the gaps of each other's lives that the marriage's practical beginnings had left unexplored. She learned that he had a sister still living in Missouri, married to a farmer, whom he wrote to twice a year and had not seen in 6. He learned that her mother had died when Ella was 12, of a fever that took half the county that terrible summer, and that Ella had raised herself largely on her father's practical wisdom and her own stubborn will ever since. They learned each other's laughter, each other's silences, the particular things that could turn a hard day soft again, and by the time the snow began to give way to the first green shoots of March, there was no pretending left in the marriage at all, only two people who had built, out of necessity and honesty and slowly accumulated trust, something that looked very much like love. It was in April, with the wildflowers beginning to bloom along the creek bank and the herd's first calves dropping healthy and strong, that Sila's crow made his final, desperate move against them. He came himself this time, riding out to Willow Creek on a gray morning with 3 hired men behind him, men Ella recognized as rough sorts who drifted through town looking for work that did not ask too many questions about their pasts. Ezekiel was out checking the herd when they arrived, and Ella met Crow on the porch alone, though she had a shotgun leaning just inside the door, her father's old habit that she had never abandoned. "Mr. Crow, I don't recall inviting you onto my land." "Your land," Crow repeated, with a thin smile that did not reach his eyes. "That's an interesting way to put it, Miss Chandler. Forgive me, Mrs. Trask. I've been doing some research, you see, into your father's will and into the exact wording of the clause that saved your land from reverting to his brother back in Ohio. The will was clear. I married within 6 months as required." "You married," Crow agreed. "But I've had a lawyer look over the language carefully, and there's a question, it seems, about whether a marriage entered into purely as a business arrangement, with an explicit agreement between the parties that no real matrimonial bond was intended, might not satisfy the spirit of your father's requirement, whatever it satisfies of the letter. Your father wanted you protected by a real husband, Miss Chandler, not a hired hand with a wedding ring. I intend to challenge the will's execution in territorial court, and I have witnesses, several of them, who overheard you yourself describing the marriage as a business arrangement in its early days." The blood drained from Ella's face even as anger rose hot behind it. "You've been spying on us." "I've been protecting my interests, Miss Chandler. You owed me money once. I intend to see this land pass into hands that will use it properly, one way or another, and if the courts agree that your marriage was a sham entered into to defraud your father's true intentions, then the land reverts, and I have already made arrangements to purchase it from your uncle in Ohio the moment it does." It was at that moment that Ezekiel rode into the yard, taking in the scene, the 3 hired men, Crow's smug expression, Ella's white face, in a single sweeping glance, and dismounted with the deliberate calm of a man who had learned long ago that showing anger in front of an enemy only gave that enemy an advantage. "Mr. Crow, I'll ask you to state your business plainly, since I doubt you rode all this way with 3 armed men for a social call." Crow repeated his claim, and Ella watched Ezekiel's jaw tighten, watched him absorb the threat and turn it over, searching for the weak point in it the way he might search a fence line for a break. You'll need more than gossip to convince a territorial judge that a legal marriage, properly performed by an ordained minister, witnessed by half the town, wasn't a real marriage, Ezekiel said finally. And you'll find, Mr. Crow, that whatever this marriage started as, it has not stayed that way. A fact that anyone in Prairie Rose with eyes in their head could testify to if it comes to that. My wife and I have shared a home, a bed, a herd of cattle, and a life together for nearly a year now. I don't think any judge in this territory is going to look at that and call it a sham, no matter what careful words we might have used the day we agreed to marry. We'll see what the judge says, Crow said, though something in his confidence had visibly wavered. We will, Ezekiel agreed. And in the meantime, Mr. Crow, I'll ask you and your men to get off this land before I decide that trespassing is a matter better settled without lawyers at all. One of the hired men shifted his hand toward the pistol at his hip, and Ezekiel's own hand moved, not to a weapon, for he wore none that morning, but to the axe handle leaning against the porch rail, a small motion but one that communicated, clearly enough, that he was not a man who would go down easily if it came to that. That's not necessary, Crow said quickly, raising a hand to still his man's movement, some flicker of caution finally overriding his anger. We're leaving, Mr. Trask, for now, but I intend to file that challenge with the territorial court in Topeka by the end of the month, and I have every confidence the truth of your marriage's origins will come out, one way or another. He turned his horse and rode off, his men following, and Ella sank onto the porch steps, her legs suddenly unsteady beneath her, as the weight of the threat settled fully over her. He could actually take it, she said. If a judge believes him, if enough people in town testify that we described the marriage as a business deal, he could actually take everything. Ezekiel sat down beside her, taking her hand in both of his. He could try, but Ella, listen to me. Whatever happens with the courts, whatever Crow manages to convince a judge of, it doesn't change what's true between us. I love you. I've loved you since that trail to Dodge City, maybe before if I'm honest with myself. No judge's ruling can undo that, whatever else it might cost us. I love you too, she said, and it was the first time she had said the words plainly, without the softening of a difficult conversation or the heat of an argument's aftermath to carry them. Just the words themselves, true and simple, and he brought her hand to his lips and kissed it gently before pulling her into his arms. They rode into town together the next day to consult with the only lawyer Prairie Rose could boast, a careful, elderly man named Mr. Abbott who had drawn up half the wills and deeds in the county over 30 years of practice. Crow's claim is weak, Mr. Abbott told them after hearing the full story, but weak claims have won in territorial courts before, particularly when the judge is inclined to favor a wealthy banker over a homesteading couple with limited means to mount a proper defense. Our best protection, I think, is testimony. If enough respectable people in this town can speak to the genuine nature of your marriage as it stands today, whatever its origins, it will be difficult for any judge to rule that the marriage fails to satisfy the spirit of your father's will. Will people speak for us? Ella asked. Half the town's already gossiping about how the marriage started. Gossip is one thing, Mrs. Trask. Sworn testimony before a judge is another. I suspect you'll find more friends than you expect if you ask directly. They spent the following weeks doing exactly that, riding to every homestead and farm within a day's ride, asking neighbors, some of whom Ella had known her whole life and others she barely knew at all, to speak on their behalf if the matter came to court. It was humbling work, laying bare the private business of a marriage for the judgment of neighbors, but it was also, unexpectedly, a kind of gift, because it forced Ella to see, more clearly than she ever had, how the community actually regarded her, not through the lens of Mrs. Pemberton's cruel whispers, but through the honest assessment of people who had watched her survive her father's death, marry a stranger, save her land from foreclosure, and build, against considerable odds, a life that looked, by every measure that mattered, like a genuine and happy marriage. Mrs. Abernathy, the preacher's wife who had first suggested Ezekiel's name to her, agreed without hesitation. "I've watched you two at church every Sunday morning for nearly a year," she said. "I've watched the way that man looks at you when he thinks no one's paying attention. I'll tell any judge in this territory exactly what I've seen, and gladly." Even Higgins, the cattle buyer in Dodge City, wrote a letter on their behalf when Ezekiel sent word explaining the situation, describing the young couple who had driven a herd 60 miles together and struck him, even then, as devoted to one another in a way that went well beyond simple business partnership. By the time the matter came before a circuit judge in Topeka in June, nearly 14 months after the wedding, Ezekiel and Ella had assembled testimony from nearly 24 respected members of the Prairie Rose community, along with the letter from Higgins and Mr. Abbott's careful legal argument that no wording in Thomas Chandler's will required any particular emotional content to the marriage, only that it be lawfully performed and genuinely maintained. Silas Crow's lawyer argued forcefully that the marriage had been explicitly described by both parties, in the earliest days, as a business arrangement entered into for mutual convenience rather than affection, and that this original intent should govern the will's interpretation regardless of what had developed subsequently. The judge, a heavy-set man named Judge Wilhoit with a reputation for careful deliberation, listened to both sides over the course of a long, hot afternoon in the Topeka courthouse, and then asked, unexpectedly, to hear directly from Ella and Ezekiel themselves. "Mrs. Trask," the judge said, "I would ask you plainly, whatever the marriage's origins, do you consider yourself today genuinely and lawfully married in every sense that word implies to the man beside you?" Ella stood, her hands steady despite the pounding of her heart. "Your Honor, I married Ezekiel Trask 14 months ago as a business arrangement. That much is true, and I won't pretend otherwise to this court. He married me for reasons that had as much to do with my land as with anything else, and I've never held that against him, because I offered the arrangement in exactly those terms. But something happened between us in the months since, something neither of us expected or planned for. I fell in love with my husband, Your Honor, truly and completely, and he with me, and I would ask this court to consider that a marriage's beginning need not determine its ending, that two people can build something real out of something that started as mere practicality if they choose to." "Mr. Trask," the judge said, turning to Ezekiel, "do you concur with your wife's account?" Ezekiel stood, and Ella watched him take a breath before he spoke, watched him choose his words with the same careful deliberation he brought to everything important. "Your Honor, my wife once accused me, in a moment of doubt, of marrying her for her land. I told her then, and I'll tell this court now, that I married her despite the land, not for it. I had every opportunity to walk away from this marriage, from its debts and its enemies and its complications, and instead I chose, every single day for 14 months, to stay, to work that land beside her, to build a life with her, because I love her, Your Honor, more completely than I have ever loved anything or anyone in my life. If this court rules that a marriage's practical beginnings disqualify it from being real, then I don't know what marriage this court believes it's protecting, because I've seen precious few unions in this territory, arranged for love or money both, that were tested as thoroughly as ours has been and came through it stronger rather than weaker." Judge Wilhoit was quiet a long moment, looking between them, and then he looked at Silas Crow, whose face had gone tight and pale as the testimony mounted against him. "Mr. Crow," the judge said, "I find your challenge unpersuasive. Thomas Chandler's will required a lawful marriage, freely entered into, sufficient to protect his daughter from exactly the kind of predatory interest you have demonstrated throughout these proceedings. Nothing in the will's language requires this court to examine the emotional content of that marriage on its wedding day, only its lawful existence and continued maintenance in good faith. I find that Ezekiel and Ella Trask have more than satisfied both requirements, and I am dismissing your challenge in its entirety. I would add, Mr. Crow, that the pattern of behavior described in this courtroom, cattle theft, early recall of a legitimate note, and now this challenge, built substantially on private conversations you appear to have obtained through improper surveillance of the Trask household, troubles this court considerably, and I would advise you to consider very carefully whether further harassment of this family might result in charges being brought against you rather than the outcome you seek. Crow left the courtroom without another word, his face a mask of controlled fury, and Ella did not see him again for nearly 2 years, by which time she heard, second-hand, that he had sold his interests in Prairie Rose and moved east, chasing some new scheme in a territory less hostile to his methods. Ella and Ezekiel rode home from Topeka together in a hired buggy, the June evening soft and warm around them, fireflies beginning to rise from the tall grass along the road, and somewhere along that quiet stretch of prairie, Ezekiel stopped the buggy and turned to her, taking both her hands in his. "We did it," he said, "fair and square in front of God and a territorial judge both. Nobody can ever again question whether this marriage is real." "It was always real," she said. "Maybe not on the day we married, but real enough since, real enough that I'd choose you again, Ezekiel Trask, even knowing everything I know now about how hard the road would be. I'd choose you too," he said, "every single time." He kissed her then, under the wide Kansas sky with the first stars beginning to show and the fireflies rising all around them like something out of a dream neither of them had known to hope for. And when they finally continued the ride home, she rested her head against his shoulder and thought that, whatever else her father's will had intended, it had given her, in the end, something far more valuable than land alone, something she had not thought to hope for on the cold morning of his funeral. A man who had chosen her, fully and completely, despite every practical reason not to, and had gone on choosing her every day since. The years that followed were not without their hardships, for the Plains never gave up their bounty without exacting some price in return. There was a bad winter in 1880 that took a third of their herd, despite everything they did to protect it, and a summer of grasshoppers in 1882 that stripped their wheat fields bare in a single terrible week, the insects moving across the land like a living storm cloud. And there was the ordinary grief, too, of losing Mrs. Abernathy to a fever in the winter of 1881, a loss that struck Ella harder than she expected, given how central the woman's kindness had been to the whole story of her marriage. But there was joy, too, more of it than either of them had dared imagine possible in the anxious early days of their arrangement. Their first child, a son they named Thomas after Ella's father, was born in the spring of 1879, delivered in the same bedroom Ella had grown up sleeping in, with Mrs. Abernathy attending and Ezekiel pacing the hallway outside in a state of nervous terror that Ella teased him about for years afterward. "You drove cattle 60 miles through open country without losing your nerve," she reminded him, once the ordeal was safely past and their son lay sleeping in her arms. "But a baby has you shaking like a leaf." "Cattle don't matter to me the way this boy already does," Ezekiel said, sitting carefully on the edge of the bed to look down at his son's small, red, furious face. "I never knew I could love something this much before I even properly met him." Their second child came 2 years later, a daughter they named Iris, after Mrs. Abernathy, born strong and loud in the spring of 1881. And their third, another son named Joseph, arrived in 1884, by which time the ranch had grown to nearly 1,200 acres through careful expansion and honest hard work, and the little house Ella had grown up in had grown alongside it, with a new wing added to accommodate the family it now sheltered. Ezekiel filed on the homestead land west of the creek, exactly as he had proposed that November evening so long before, though this time when he raised the subject, there was no old fear rising up to twist his words into something ugly. Instead, Ella herself rode the boundary lines with him, marking the corners, and when the claim was finally granted and recorded, she stood with him on the highest rise of the new land, looking east toward the creek and the house and the barn and all the accumulated evidence of what they had built together. 1,200 acres, she said. My father would hardly recognize this place. I think he'd recognize exactly what matters most about it, Ezekiel said, his arm around her shoulders, their children playing somewhere behind them in the tall grass, their laughter carrying on the wind the way birdsong carries, easy and constant and full of a future neither Ella nor Ezekiel could have predicted on the day they shook hands like men closing a cattle deal outside a livery stable. He wanted you protected and loved and settled somewhere you'd never have to be afraid again. I think whatever he might say about the acreage, he'd be glad of that much at least. I think you're right. She turned in his arms to face him, this man who had ridden into her life as a stranger and become, through hardship and honesty and the slow accumulation of 1,000 ordinary days, the truest thing she had ever known. Do you ever regret it, marrying a stranger for a piece of land, staying despite everything that came after? I told you once, he said, and it's just as true now as it was then. I married you despite the land, Ella. Every hardship since, every drought and thieving banker and grasshopper plague, I'd take it all again gladly, because it brought me to you, to this family we've built. There's no version of my life I'd trade for this one, land or no land. She kissed him then, on that high rise overlooking everything they had built together, with their children's laughter carrying on the prairie wind and the deep, unfailing creek running clear and cold below, feeding land that had once nearly been lost to greed and was now, fully and completely, a testament to something far more valuable than any acreage could measure. Two people who had begun with an arrangement and built, through choice renewed daily, a genuine and abiding love. They grew old on that land together, through the remaining decades of the century and into the next, watching Prairie Rose grow from a scattering of gray buildings into a proper town, with a rail spur and a proper schoolhouse where their children, and eventually their grandchildren, learned their letters. Thomas grew up to run cattle much as his father had taught him, marrying a schoolteacher named Grace who came west from Illinois in 1899. Iris married a doctor who set up practice in the growing town, and Joseph, the youngest, surprised everyone by developing a passion for the new science of irrigation, studying at a college in Topeka before returning home to help expand the family's use of Willow Creek's steady waters across even more of the land his parents had fought so hard to keep. Ella Chandler Trask died in her own bed in the spring of 1924, at the age of 68, with Ezekiel beside her holding her hand exactly as he had held it that first frightened night on the trail to Dodge City 46 years earlier. He followed her 18 months later, and they were buried together on a small rise overlooking the creek, not far from where Thomas Chandler himself had been laid to rest so long ago, with a single headstone that their children had commissioned to mark both graves, engraved with words that Iris had chosen from among her mother's old letters, words that seemed, to everyone in the family who read them in the years that followed, to capture the whole of the story better than any lengthy epitaph could have managed. Married for the land, stayed for love, together always. It was, everyone in Prairie Rose agreed, exactly the ending their story deserved, and exactly the ending, though neither of them could have known it on that cold spring morning at Thomas Chandler's graveside so many years before, that a stubborn young woman and a tired, drifting cowboy had built for themselves, one honest day at a time, out of nothing more than a desperate bargain, and the slow, unexpected miracle of falling genuinely and completely in love.